If you grew up in Britain, the chances are your first bicycle was a Raleigh. The heron stamped on the frame of the bike that taught a generation to balance, to pedal, to fall off and get back on. At its peak, Raleigh employed close to 8,800 people in the largest bicycle factory in the world and exported to 140 countries. It survived the Great Depression. It survived 2 world wars, turning its forges to munitions while its frames went to the front. It survived the post-war years when the whole country bought cars and cycle sales halved. It weathered everything the 20th century threw at it and kept the gates open. And then, after 114 years in Nottingham, Raleigh simply stopped making bicycles. How does a name that meant something to every family in Britain, a company that survived all of that, just disappear? What really happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. A Dying Man's Prescription. The story starts, as so many British industrial stories do, with something small. A workshop on a back street in Nottingham. 12 men, 3 bicycles a week. The city ran on lace in those days, mile upon mile of it, spun and knotted in tall brick mills, sold to the drawing rooms of the empire. Bicycles were a sideline. There were perhaps 15 little makers scattered across Nottingham, and the one on Raleigh Street was among the smallest of them. And into it, in the summer of 1887, walked a dying man. His name was Frank Bowden, and by the measure of the age, he had already lived a full life. Born in 1848 into a family of Bristol and Devon manufacturers, he'd trained as a lawyer, then gone out east and made a genuine fortune. Investments in Hong Kong and San Francisco, the kind of money that buys a man a place in the world. But the climate of the East had taken it back out of him. He came home to England in the 1880s, a wealthy man with a wrecked constitution, and the doctors did not give him long. The popular account places the consultation at Harrogate, among the Spa waters, where the well-to-do went to be told bad news gently. 6 months, they said, perhaps a little more. The prescription was not medicine. It was a bicycle. Take up cycling, the doctor told him. Get out into the air. Move. And Bowden, a serious man, a man who did things thoroughly, did exactly that. He rode and kept riding, and the daily exercise had, in his own words, a remarkable effect in restoring his health and vigour. The man given 6 months lived another 34 years. He never forgot who had saved him. It was not the doctor, it was the machine. So he wanted a better one. And that hunt for a better bicycle is what carried him to the little workshop on Raleigh Street, where a Frenchman named Paul Angoisse and an Englishman named Richard Morris Woodhead built machines by hand. Bowden looked at what they made, the changeable gear, the small refinements the bigger makers hadn't bothered with, and judged it superior to anything else he'd seen. He bought one. He toured France and Italy and England on it, across 1887 and 1888. And then he did the thing that makes a man an industrialist rather than a customer. He bought the workshop. In December of 1888, he founded the Raleigh Cycle Company as a limited liability concern, registered the following January. He kept the name of the street because a good name costs nothing and means everything. He moved the whole operation into a 5-story former lace factory on Russell Street, bicycles rising in a building that had made the city's older fortune. Warren Ellis brought lace trade capital and lace trade contacts into it, and the money began to move. This was the exact moment the bicycle was becoming something new. The old penny farthing, that absurd, dangerous, high-wheeled toy for athletic young men, was giving way to the safety bicycle. 2 wheels of a size, a diamond frame, a chain. A machine an ordinary person could actually ride. It was, quietly, one of the great democratizing inventions of the century, and Bowden had walked into it at the ground floor. He moved fast. Within a few years, the company was capitalized at £100,000, something close to $5 million in today's money. By 1896, it was registered at double that, and already the largest bicycle manufacturer in the world. One myth deserves clearing away here, because it clings to his name. Many people say Frank Bowden invented the Bowden cable, the sheathed control cable that runs through every brake lever on Earth. There's no evidence he did. The names simply rhyme with coincidence, but the larger truth stands, and it's the strangest founding story in British industry. The biggest bicycle empire the world would ever see was born from a prescription. A rich man was told he was dying, was handed a bicycle, and lived, and spent the rest of his life selling other people the thing that had saved him. Chapter 2. The All-Steel Bicycle. To understand what Raleigh became, you have to understand what a bicycle was in those early years, and how easily it killed you. The machines of the 1890s were assemblies of compromise. Components were cast, poured into molds, and cast iron is brittle. It shatters. Rims were made of wood, which warped in the wet and rotted over a season. The joints where the tubes met, the crown of the fork above the front wheel, the lugs that held the frame together, these were the places a bicycle failed. And when a bicycle failed at speed, it did so without warning and without mercy. Raleigh's answer to this became a phrase, then a philosophy, and eventually the whole identity of the marque, the all-steel bicycle. The man who built the engineering behind it was G.P. Mills, works manager, chief designer, and, not incidentally, one of the finest racing cyclists Britain had produced. Mills had ridden the terrible long-distance road records of the era. He knew in his own legs and hands exactly how a machine broke, and what he drove Raleigh towards was total steel. Not cast, forged and pressed and joined. The industry was learning, in these same years, that steel tubing could be drawn thinner in the middle and left thicker at the ends where the stress lived. Butted tubing, the innovation an engineer named Alfred Millward Reynolds patented in 1897, and which let a frame be light and strong at once. Raleigh built on exactly that principle, and then went further than anyone. The method of joining was called brazing, and Raleigh raised it to something close to art. Discs of steel were taken through a sequence of press operations and careful annealings, heatings and slow coolings, until they had become the lugs, the sculpted sockets that cradle the tubes. All the fine properties of the steel, the company said, were retained through it. Then the joints were made not by welding, which scorches and weakens, but by drawing molten brass into them. Heat the joint, touch it with brass, and the liquid metal runs by capillary action into every hairline gap between tube and lug, into the smallest crevices, the catalogue said, binding the two metals together as no other method could. When it cooled, the frame wasn't a set of parts bolted into proximity. It was a single object, monolithic, repairable, and extraordinarily, almost stupidly, durable. And Raleigh made all of it themselves. This is the part that is hard to grasp now, in an age of supply chains. Raleigh did not buy a frame and hang-bought parts on it. They forged the cranks, pressed the mudguards and the chain guard, made the rims and the handlebars and the stem and the seat post and the rack, everything but the tyres and the chain, in steel, under their own roof, to their own standard. A 1950 catalogue described one model with a flat and unarguable pride. This all-steel bicycle really is all steel. Now, honesty matters in a eulogy. So here is the honest version of the legend. The claim that a Raleigh could survive a war is marketing. It is also, awkwardly for the skeptics, close to literally true. Raleigh frames did serve in 2 world wars, and there are men still riding, on roads today, machines their grandfathers bought new. Not every export model was fully brazed. Some of the big colonial roadsters used other construction. And from the 1980s, welding would gradually replace brazing on the mass-market frames. But the 3-speed roadsters, the ones that defined the name, were brazed, built genuinely to outlive their owners. That durability made the name valuable, and value invites theft. Rival makers copied Raleigh's fork crowns and details so closely that the company had to warn its customers in print to check for the genuine mark, the heron, stamped on the head of the frame. Look for the bird, the catalogue said, or you have not bought a Raleigh. Because all steel was never really a slogan. It was a creed. Raleigh's founding conviction was that a bicycle should not be a disposable thing that let you down on a dark road, but a permanent object, forged rather than assembled, that a working family could trust with their lives and hand down like a watch. That conviction is the emotional spine of everything that follows, and, in the end, the bitter irony of it, too. Chapter 3. The name on the hub. There is a second thing Raleigh gave the world, and it changed daily life more profoundly than the frame ever did. It's the gear, and the story of who invented it is a small masterpiece of injustice, one this film means to put right. Before the enclosed hub gear, a hill was a wall. You rode until the gradient beat you, and then you got off and pushed. Exposed gears existed, the derailleur kind, but they were delicate, filthy, forever slipping, hopeless in the British weather. What ordinary people needed was gearing that lived sealed inside the rear hub, weatherproof, near maintenance free, indifferent to rain and grit. 3 ratios in a sealed drum. Change gear, standing at the curb. Ride up the hill you used to walk. The world knows this as the Sturmey Archer 3-speed. The world is wrong about almost everything in that name. The man who actually invented it was called William Raleigh, born in 1867, an engineer from Salford. In 1898, Raleigh designed the first commercially successful compact hub gear, a 2-speed, launched by a Salford firm called the Hub 2-Speed Gear Company. And in a decision that would erase him from history, Raleigh signed away the rights to all his future gear designs to that company. Then, around 1902, he designed something far better, a 3-speed, lighter and simpler than any rival, with a reliable toggle chain to shift it. But he no longer owned his own ideas. So to get the new gear out from under that contract, the patents were taken out not in Raleigh's name, but in the name of a colleague, a man called James Archer, who functioned, in effect, as a legal stand-in. Archer's contribution to the 3-speed hub was chiefly the loan of his name to a patent. And Henry Sturmey was a famous man, but famous as a journalist. He founded the Cyclist and the Autocar. He was one of the great editorial voices of early cycling and motoring. He had patented a 3-speed hub of his own in 1901, and by March of 1902 he'd handed the sole rights to it to Frank Bowden. He was not, in any meaningful sense, the engineer of the gear that bears his name. The documented record is even sharper than that. Raleigh's patent, filed under Archer's name, went in 11 days before Sturmey's. Here Bowden the businessman is at his most brilliant and his most ruthless. He saw Raleigh's superior 3-speed and understood at once that if a rival got it, Raleigh was finished in gears. So he brought the whole tangle of men and patents together, and in January 1903 formed the 3-speed gear syndicate. Bowden, Sturmey, Archer and Raleigh all named among the directors. And on the very day the syndicate was formed, Archer and Raleigh signed a private agreement, out of public sight, that the royalties for the Archer hub would flow to the man who'd actually invented it, to Raleigh. The name was a cover story, built deliberately. Raleigh couldn't lend his own name to it. The hub company was making legal threats. Sturmey's name went on first because Sturmey was famous, and because a famous journalist's name made a fine screen to hide the real inventor behind. An elaborate tale was concocted of technical collaboration between Sturmey and Archer, 2 men working side by side. It portrayed Sturmey as the leading figure, a fiction he was content to maintain for the rest of his life. His actual role in the enterprise lasted about 18 months, a director from January 1903. He was gone by July 1904 and never worked with Bowden or Raleigh again. His involvement had consisted of little more than allowing his name to endorse the product. And Raleigh, the man who should have had a job for life, by 1909 he'd fallen out badly with Frank Bowden and his son Harold. The trigger, by most accounts, was Raleigh's own brother Harry, who had helped set up a rival gear company using a discarded design of Williams, without Williams' knowledge. The Bowden suspected the worst. Raleigh left, was paid out for his shares, and walked away from the thing he'd made. His improved design went on to be built by BSA into the 1950s. His name went on nothing at all. By the early 1920s, Raleigh was turning out 250,000 hub gears a year. The sealed 3-speed did exactly what it promised. It put reliable, weatherproof gearing within reach of every working commuter, in every hilly city, the world over. The postman, the miner, the mill girl, all of them could now ride up the hill they'd once pushed a bicycle up. It was one of the quiet revolutions in how ordinary people moved through the world. The most famous gear in cycling history is named after a journalist who lent his name and a man who was a legal proxy, while William Raleigh, who actually invented it, remains all but unknown, his name stamped on nothing, whilst other men's names were pressed into every hub shell for 100 years. The gear was a triumph. Bowden's commercial genius was real. But somewhere under the triumph, a Salford engineer was written out of his own life's work. It's worth saying his name plainly, because so few ever have. William Raleigh. Chapter 4. The largest in the world. By the turn of the century, the Little Russell Street Works was long outgrown. In 1897, Raleigh built itself a purpose-made home on Faraday Road in the Lenton district of Nottingham, 7.5 acres of it, which felt at the time like an empire's worth of ground. By 1913, 1,700 workers there were turning out more than 60,000 cycles a year, and Raleigh was, by any measure that mattered, the biggest bicycle manufacturer on earth. Then came the First War, and the works learned the trade it would practice again a generation later. The workforce swelled from around 2,000 in 1915 to 5,000 by 1918, and much of what they made was no longer bicycles, but munitions. Raleigh discovered that the same presses and forges and disciplined hands that built the all-steel bicycle could build the tools of war just as precisely. It was a lesson the company filed away. Frank Bowden died in 1921, leaving an estate of around £475,000 and a company that was the wonder of the industry. The crown passed to his son, Sir Harold Bowden, who would run Raleigh for the better part of 17 years through its greatest expansion. Harold was a different sort of man from his father, and one moment shows it. During the general strike of 1926, 800 Raleigh workers came out in sympathy with the miners. When it was over, Harold did not punish them. He introduced a profit-sharing scheme. He wanted, he said, his employees to be proud to work for Raleigh, believed it was simply right to treat them fairly. It was paternalism, certainly, with all the quiet control that word carries. But in an age when many owners answered a strike with lockouts and blacklists, Harold Bowden answered it by cutting his workers into the profit. And he built. Vertical integration remained the gospel. Raleigh made everything but tyres and chains. In 1932, the company took over Humber as a premium marque. It dabbled briefly in motorcycles and even a three-wheeled little car in 1933, then thought better of it and returned to what it did best. The financial shape of the firm grew to match its ambition. From the private company of 1888, capitalised first at £100,000 and then £200,000, it re-emerged in 1934 as Raleigh Cycle Holdings Limited, floated to the public with a share issue of more than £2 million. In time, it would gather up the old names of the British trade beneath the Heron, Rudge Whitworth, and after the war the cycle interests of BSA and Triumph, marques that had once been rivals, now absorbed into the one great firm. By 1938, Raleigh was building close to 500,000 bicycles a year. Then the Second War came, and the Nottingham Works turned almost entirely to munitions once more. Nearly 5,000 people, a great many of them women, worked round-the-clock shifts making the materials of the fight. The company recorded that service afterwards in a publication with a title that says everything about how it saw itself. Thus we served. Even the bicycles bent to the war. The budget Gazelle range was patriotically renamed Robin Hood after Nottingham's own outlaw. Through all of it flew the Heron. The bird was drawn from the Bowden family crest, stamped on the head of every frame, printed on the chainrings and the transfers, forever alongside those three words: the all-steel bicycle. There is a romantic local legend that herons once fished the streams beside the old lace factories. Nobody can prove it. The mark itself changed and grew over the decades. The Heron and Torch crest of the late 1960s, the Raleigh Cycle Company Heron crest that came in from 1972, but it was always, unmistakably, the bird. It became the most trusted trademark in British cycling, and men learned to look for it the way you'd look for a hallmark on silver. This was the shape of Raleigh at its full height, a firm that shared its profits and owned its entire process, that made the steel and forged the parts and brazed the frames and painted them and sold them to the world. It did not merely lead the market. For the ordinary British buyer, Raleigh very nearly was the market. Chapter 5. A works the size of a town. Walk with me for a moment into the Lenton Works at its peak. In 1951, Raleigh built over 1 million bicycles in a single year and shipped as many as 7 in every 10 of them overseas. To make that many machines, you need not a factory, but something closer to a small industrial town, and that is exactly what the works had become. Press shops where sheet steel was stamped into shape with a concussion you felt in your chest. Forges, brazing hearths glowing along the frame lines. The enamelling shops where the frames were dipped and baked to that deep, glassy black. The plating lines where handlebars and rims came out bright as mirrors. Machine shops running on belts and lathes, floor after floor of them. It was loud, and it was dangerous, and the men and women who worked there remembered both with something that sits between fondness and warning. There was machinery, one of them recalled, that could rip your arm off, said not with horror, but with the flat matter-of-factness of people who had worked alongside it for 40 years. And there was the other Raleigh too, the one up in the head office in the Howitt building on Lenton Boulevard, built in 1931, with its plush canteen and its white tablecloths, a world away from the noise of the shop floor, and yet somehow part of the same family. We are lucky, in one respect, that the works was filmed while it lived. In 1945, the British Council sent cameras into the Lenton factory to make a documentary called How a Bicycle is Made, and that film survives. The process caught whole, steel going in one end, and a finished bicycle coming out the other, the actual hands and faces of Raleigh at work. It is one of the only ways left to stand, even for a few minutes, inside a place that no longer exists. The finest witness to that flaw, though, never worked in the office. Alan Sillitoe was a Raleigh man before he was a novelist, and when he came to write Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, he set it here, among the lathes. His hero, Arthur Seaton. Albert Finney in the film, cigarette at his lip, contempt in his eye, stands at his capstan lathe as the enduring literary image of the British working man. Millions who never heard the Lenton hooter know that factory floor, because Sillitoe put it into the national imagination and left it there. The bicycle itself moved through the building like water finding its level. Steel came in at one end, then the drop forging and the pressing, the cutting and butting of tubes, the shaping of the lugs, then the brazing lines, where the frames became single objects, then the filers, who dressed every joint smooth by hand, one at a time, thousands upon thousands of them, then enameling, then plating, then the wheel builders, lacing spokes with a speed that looked like sleight of hand, and finally, assembly, and a finished bicycle rolling off to be created for Lagos or Delhi or Toronto. Nearly all of it, still, under one roof. To walk the length of the process was to walk the length of the whole industry, compressed into a single site. And around the work there grew a whole life. Whole families passed through those gates. The Smith family alone had 9 of its members working across the site at one time. There was a voluntary fire brigade on Faraday Road, manned by the workers themselves. There was a social club, sports teams, works outings. The engineering trade unions were there too, in the lineage that would become the AEEU, the same organised strength that had brought 800 men out in sympathy in 1926. It was a community woven so deep into the city that Nottingham could no more imagine itself without Raleigh than without the Trent. That community changed too, and grew richer for it. Women had worked the presses and the lines in their thousands, above all through the war. And from 1956, men and women of the Windrush generation came into the works, a story the Nottingham Black Archive has been recovering in its project when we worked at Raleigh. There was Royden Allen, who trained as a technician apprentice and had followed his own mother into the press shop. There was Howard Edwards, who started as a machine operator and became a welder. The photographer Vanley Burke recorded their faces. They were Raleigh people, as much as any Bowden, because that is what the Lenton Works had become by the 1950s. Not a place people merely went to earn a wage, but a self-contained civilization, with its own fire brigade and its own hierarchies, its own dangers and its own dignities, its own novelist to remember it, and its own film to prove it was real. A town that happened to make bicycles. Chapter 6. The Bike of Empire and Childhood. Here is the wonder of Raleigh at its zenith. In the very same years, wearing the very same heron, it was 3 completely different companies, and each one would have been a triumph on its own. The first was the Bicycle of Empire. Across Africa and India, Raleigh sold black 28-inch roadsters by the shipload, the DL1 Tourist, the Sports, the stately Superbay. Heavy, upright, unkillable machines, sold as serious transport built to last, and last they did, on roads that would have destroyed a lesser bike in a month. A new factory opened at Kano, in northern Nigeria, in the early 1970s, turning out something like 200,000 cycles a year. And in Nigeria, the name did the thing that only the very greatest brands ever do. It stopped being a name and became the word. A bicycle, any bicycle, was simply a Raleigh, the way a vacuum cleaner in Britain is a Hoover. There were works and offices in America, in East Africa, in South Africa, in India, in Canada, in Holland and West Germany, and Malaysia. Making old-fashioned roadsters, unglamorous and eternal, was quietly the most profitable thing Raleigh did. The second was the bicycle of glory. Raleigh sponsored Reg Harris, Britain's greatest track sprinter, world professional champion in 1949, 1950, 1951, and again in 1954, Olympic silver medalist before that. The advertising campaign built around him, Reg Harris Rides a Lenton, became one of the most successful in British history for the simplest of reasons. Everyone knew Reg rode a Raleigh. Decades later, that same instinct would carry Raleigh to the summit of the sport itself. But hold that thought a moment, because the third Raleigh is the one you probably remember yourself, if you're British and of a certain age, the bicycle of childhood. In 1970, Raleigh launched the Chopper, high-backed seat, long banana saddle, a great fat rear wheel and a little front one, styled like a drag racer for 10-year-olds. Its design is still argued over between Raleigh's own Alan Oakley and Tom Carron of Ogle Design, and the truth is probably tangled between them. What isn't in doubt is what happened next. Over 1.5 million choppers sold in Britain. By 1973, it was the best-selling bicycle in the country, outselling its rivals 6-1. It was the thing every child begged for at Christmas, the ultimate playground machine, and it lodged itself so deep in the culture that it turned up years later on cinema screens without needing to be explained. Then, as that faded, came the next one. In 1982, riding the BMX craze that the film E.T. had set alight, Raleigh released the burner. By the company's own reckoning, over 500,000 burners sold in the first 2 years, the most successful BMX ever made. It signed the country's #1 rider, Andy Ruffle. Its team's Craig Schofield became world #1. Between the Chopper and the burner, the grifter had bridged the generations. For 20 years, learning to ride a bicycle in Britain meant, overwhelmingly, learning to ride a Raleigh. And now, return to Reg Harris and the summit of the sport, because this is where the three worlds meet. Under a formidable Dutch directeur sportif named Peter Post, Raleigh built professional cycling's first true super team, TI Raleigh, in its black, red and yellow. In 1980, Joop Zoetemelk rode that jersey to victory in the Tour de France, in an edition where the team won 11 stages. Jan Raas, Gerry Knetemann, Henny Kuiper, a roster that won hundreds of races and dominated the team time trials of its era. So stand at that summit and look at what Raleigh was. In a single decade, it was the bicycle that carried a farmer to market in northern Nigeria, the bicycle a child in Nottingham unwrapped on Christmas morning, and the bicycle that won the greatest race on earth. 3 worlds. 1 bird. At the works themselves, the numbers had never looked better. By 1975, something close to 8,800 people worked at the Nottingham site, the best documented peak in the company's history. After a great expansion in 1957, opened in person by Field Marshal Lord Montgomery, the works sprawled across the best part of 64 acres. By 1979, Nottingham alone could build 2 million cycles a year, employed around 7,500, exported 60% of British production, held 60% of the home market, sold into 140 countries, and was still, after 90 years, the largest bicycle manufacturer in the world. Raleigh believed itself unassailable. The heron was everywhere. The Tour was won. Nothing, from the inside, looked like it could touch them. And yet, back in 1974, when a man named Ian Phillips was appointed chairman, one of the first things his own finance director said to him about this vast, integrated, world-beating works was that it was the biggest white elephant in Britain. At the very peak, in the same decade they won the Tour de France and sold 1.5 million choppers, the men running Raleigh already suspected that the greatest bicycle factory on earth had become a liability. They just didn't yet know what it would cost to find out. Chapter 7. The White Elephant. The trouble had a date, and the date was the 19th of April, 1960. On that day, Tube Investments, a great engineering conglomerate the ordinary cyclist had never heard of, took over Raleigh for £10.8 million through its British Cycle Corporation. On paper, it looked like strength consolidating. a friendly merger of the two largest bicycle makers in Britain, two firms that between them held 80% of the home market, and weeks before it, Raleigh had quietly bought Carlton Cycles of Worksop, the small Nottinghamshire firm that would become its quality lightweight arm. Good instinct, wrong moment. From 1961, TI consolidated all production at Nottingham, and Raleigh became a division inside an engineering group. The whole thing turned on a single fact about the new owners, and it was fatal. Tube Investments did not find bicycles interesting. They did not think them particularly profitable. To Raleigh, the bicycle had been a creed, forged in-house, brazed by hand, stamped with the heron and sold as salvation. To TI, it was a line on a balance sheet, and not a very exciting line. The company that had believed a bicycle should outlive its owner was now owned by men who measured it against tube mills. Meanwhile, the ground had been shifting under the whole industry for a decade, and it went on shifting. Between 1950 and 1962, cycle sales in Britain simply halved. The reason was sitting in every new driveway. The ordinary family that had once owned bicycles now wanted a car, and got one. After the TI takeover, Raleigh's sales fell by nearly half. And here the pattern that would kill Raleigh first shows its face, the habit of looking at the future and refusing to believe in it. Consider the small wheeler and a man named Alex Moulton. In 1961, Moulton, an engineer of real distinction, came to Raleigh with a radical design, a compact bicycle on small wheels with proper suspension, a genuinely new idea about what a bike could be. Raleigh's managing director, Leslie Roberts, refused to believe it could ever be profitable and turned him away. So Moulton built his own factory and made it himself, and it sold. Raleigh's answer, in 1965, was to bring out an imitation, the RSW-16, and start a trade war with a man it had shown the door. Then, in 1967, having failed to see it coming and failed to beat it, Raleigh simply bought Moulton out. Refuse the future. Imitate the future. Buy the future once someone else has proved it. Remember that sequence. Raleigh would run through it again, on a far deadlier scale, because the real reckoning was the mountain bike. In the 1980s, the fat-tired, many-geared mountain bike came out of America, and Japanese and then Taiwanese and American manufacturers drove it into a revolution. It changed what a bicycle was for a whole generation. Raleigh, later, would claim it had been there at the start. It hadn't, not really. Its early efforts, machines like the Bomber, simply did not cut it, and it did not launch a serious mountain bike, the Maverick, until 1985, by which time the race was already lost. There had been a briefer, brighter miss too, the BMX boom of the early 80s, which the burner had ridden so triumphantly, turned out to be a fashion. When BMX collapsed, it left Raleigh exposed, chasing the last craze while the next one arrived from abroad. The numbers tell the rest without needing much help. By 1981, foreign makers had taken 36% of the British market. Raleigh's share slid toward 45%, and its Nottingham workforce fell to around 4,000, less than half what it had been 6 years earlier. Raleigh had stopped being fully integrated. It was buying in components now, the very thing it had once scorned, the very independence that had been its pride. Then, in 1987, came the fact that ought to have stopped the country in its tracks. For the first time in the history of a nation that had once made bicycles for the world, British buyers bought more imported bikes than homemade ones. Imports would soon take 60% of the market outright. 3 straight years of losses ran up to that year. And this is the terrible turn in the story, the one the finance director had seen coming back in 1974, when he told the incoming chairman that the works was the biggest white elephant in Britain. He was right, and this is why. The vast, integrated works, 64 acres of forges and press shops and plating lines, the very thing that had made Raleigh mighty, had become the thing that made it slow. A factory built to forge everything in-house cannot turn on a sixpence when the world suddenly wants light, cheap, fashionable bikes shipped in boxes from the Far East. Its strength was its anchor, and the water was rising. Chapter 8. Sold for £30. What follows is a sequence of decisions, each made by real people under real pressure, and each one leaving Raleigh a little smaller and a little further from the hands that had built it. They are worth taking slowly, one at a time. This is where a great company was taken apart. The first decision was really 27 years of one decision. Tube Investments treating the bicycle as a mature, unglamorous division and starving it accordingly. Sir Ivan Stedderford's board and its managing director Leslie Roberts were not wicked men. They ran an engineering conglomerate and allocated capital where they believed it would earn. Bicycles to them weren't it. The consequence was the molten miss, the mountain bike miss, and the 3 years of losses. The human consequence sits in a single line of arithmetic, a workforce that fell from 8,800 in 1975 toward 1,800 by 1987. Somewhere inside that fall are 7,000 Nottingham lives. The second decision was the sale. On the 1st of April 1987, TI lost patience and left the business it had never loved. The buyer was Derby International, a Luxembourg-registered concern led by Alan Finden Crofts, formerly chief of Dunlop Slasinger, together with an attorney named Ed Gottesman. The price was £18 million plus £14 million in assumed debt, for a firm coming off 3 years of losses with a workforce already cut to 1,800. And for a while, this is the cruel part, it worked. Derby's timing was extraordinary. The mountain bike boom Raleigh had missed as a maker now lifted it as a seller. UK sales rose by around a third by 1990, and Raleigh would eventually shift over 3 million mountain bikes. Derby grew into a global group, swallowing Kalkoff and Nishiki and Univega and Diamondback, and by 1992 it was the largest cycle group in the world, $500 million in turnover. Nottingham got a reprieve, but the reprieve had a shape to it that nobody quite noticed at first. The ownership was offshore now and financially driven, and the managing directors began to churn. Sandy Roberts, then Howard Knight, then Mark Todd, then from January 2000, a man named Philip Darnton. Each new name a little further from the shop floor than the last. The third decision cut into the flesh. In late 1999, Derby sold the Triumph Road site in Lenton to the University of Nottingham, and on the 10th of December that year, the frame-making equipment went under the auctioneer's hammer, including 3 multi-robot welding machines that had been bought new, at considerable cost, only 3 years before, in 1996. Think about that. Machines bought to secure the future of frame-making in Nottingham, sold for scrap value before they were 4 years old. After 111 years, Raleigh stopped making its own frames. From now on, it would assemble bicycles from frames made elsewhere. In a city that had forged its reputation as home to the finest cycle maker in the world, this landed as something close to a civic bereavement. Derby's chief executive of the day, Gary Matthews, Harvard, McKinsey, Pepsi, Guinness, a resume from a different planet than Faraday Road, handed his executives paperweights engraved 6101, his target of $61 million profit in the year 2001. It was a target the company would never come close to meeting, and then came the fourth decision, and it is the one that should never be forgotten. On the 1st of July, 2000, Derby sold Sturmey Archer. Sturmey Archer, the gear that had put reliable, weatherproof gearing within reach of every working commuter on Earth. The name, however unjust its origins, however much it owed to a Salford engineer, written out of his own invention, that had been stamped into hubshells for 98 years. Derby sold it, and the Brooks Saddle Company along with it, for £30. £30. The price of a single hub gear. The buyers were a firm called Lanark of Heathfield in East Sussex, and its directors are worth naming because the names tell you exactly what kind of sale this was. There was Clive Walton, there was Barry Robinson, listed at an address on Sunnywood Drive, Las Vegas, and described as a professional gambler, and there was an analyst named Simon also, a recently discharged bankrupt. Even the agreed £30 was never fully paid. Only a £10 down payment ever actually changed hands. Alongside it went some £2.75 million earmarked for moving and redundancy costs. The historian Tony Hadland, in his elegy for the firm, put it without ornament. They sold Sturmey Archer and Brooks for the price of a 3-speed hub to a shady British management firm that had already been investigated for fraud. Lanark was interconnected with other companies already in receivership. It drew £62,000 a month in management fees for 2 months. It held 2 board meetings. Why would Derby do such a thing? Because a rival, Sunrace of Taiwan, had already made a generous offer for the division, an offer in the tens of millions. Derby chose the £30 instead. Selling to Lennox took the whole business off Derby's balance sheet cleanly, at a stroke, and made the short-term figures look better. That was the logic. That was the whole of it. 100 years of engineering weighed against the tidiness of a quarterly account, and found lighter. The consequence arrived that October. The employees of Sturmey Archer were called together and told, with something like 10 minutes' notice, that the company was closed. An insolvency practitioner, Tony Murphy of Smith and Williamson, was brought in. A creditors' meeting was held in Birmingham on the 2nd of October. That November, some £800,000 of the firm's liquid assets were frozen. Sunrace, in the end, bought the intellectual property for a fraction of what it had once offered and moved production to Taiwan. Over 300 workers lost their jobs. Many had come to Sturmey Archer straight from school and given it 30-40 years of their working lives. They did not receive the lump sums they were owed for that long service. The ones kept on to the very end got no severance at all. And one detail, reported afterwards, stands for all the rest. One of the firm's top engineers ended up selling sandwiches in the middle of Nottingham. A man who had spent his life inside one of the great achievements of British engineering, making up rounds behind a counter. There is a final wound, and it is the sharpest. Gary Matthews had publicly given his word that all staff pensions would still be honoured. Both Sturmey Archer pension schemes, the general scheme and the staff scheme, were formally wound up, the notices appearing in the London Gazette in March 2004. Claims due by that May. This was before the Pension Protection Fund existed. It would not come until 2005. There was no statutory safety net beneath these people. The promise had been given in public. The schemes were wound up regardless. The gear that transformed cycling for millions was sold for the price of one of its own hubs, and the men and women who had made it for a lifetime were sent home with 10 minutes' notice and left exposed. If there is a single moment in this whole long fall where you feel the floor go out from under you, it is this one. Chapter 9. The Last Wheel. After that, the end came quickly, and it came quietly. Derby did not survive its own arithmetic. On the 20th of August, 2001, the Derby Cycle Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States. A management buyout followed, led once again by Alan Finden Crofts, which acquired around $95 million of assets, debt-free, and formed a new Raleigh Cycle Limited. The businesses it took on had turned over some $280 million in 2001 from 1.4 million bicycles. There was still a company here. There were still bicycles to sell, and on the 11th of March, 2002, the 12 members of the Raleigh executive took the last decision that mattered. They agreed to cease all cycle assembly in the United Kingdom by the end of that year. The reasons were the reasons of the age. Cheap imports from the Far East. A Triumph road site that had to be vacated for the university by the end of 2003. And a planned new assembly plant at Bulwell that ran aground in the most peculiar, most stubbornly British final indignity imaginable. A dispute over allotments. There were objectors, backed by a farmer, and there was, it was gravely reported, the matter of some potentially homeless newts. 114 years of Nottingham bicycle building, and one of the last acts of the drama was a planning row over a patch of vegetable gardens and the wildlife that lived there. Frame making had ended in 1999. Assembly ended at the close of 2002. Around 280 jobs went with it. From 2003, Raleigh bicycles would arrive fully assembled from suppliers in the Far East, handled through a Nottinghamshire distribution centre where perhaps 100 office and warehouse staff would move 300,000 boxed bikes a year. The last day did not look like the end of anything grand. There was a buffet. There were speeches from the managers. There were redundancy checks handed across a table. And then the people put on their coats and went home. Barry Wheat was the last wheelmaker. He could not understand why the television cameras had been kept out, why nobody was being allowed to record the historic final day of the world's most famous bicycle works. The answer, when he learned it, was its own small heartbreak. The managers didn't want the cameras there because they didn't want the world to hear the words, "Raleigh is no more." Not yet. There were still bicycles to sell. The brand had to be protected from the death of the thing that made it real. So the great works fell silent without ceremony. The machinery was left standing. Unassembled components were left where they lay. One man who was there described it afterwards in a phrase that says everything. The place, he said, had that Marie Celeste feeling. A ship found drifting, the table still laid, the crew simply gone. A works that has run for a century has a particular presence. Not just the machines, the movement of thousands of people, the low, unbroken hum, the ventilation, the acoustic weight of all that life. When it stops, the first thing you notice is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of a silence that should not be there, a silence in the wrong shape. The photographer Jeff Young recorded those last months in black and white, and his prints were later shown at Nottingham's Broadway cinema. The lines that once throbbed with activity, one caption ran, "Now stand silent." On that Lenten site, Nottingham's reputation as home to the finest cycle maker in the world was forged, and those days are gone, and only memories remain. The cycling campaigner Hugh McClintock said the plainest and truest thing of all. Raleigh was part of Nottingham's heritage. In 2003, the factory was demolished. The head office moved out to Church Street in Eastwood, and on the ground where up to 8,800 people had once forged a city's worth of steel into bicycles, the bulldozers made ready for something else entirely. Chapter 10. The Empty Nest. Go to Lenton now, and you will find it, but you will not find Raleigh. Where the forges and the press shops and the brazing lines once roared, there stands the Jubilee campus of the University of Nottingham, sleek, low, energy efficient, all glass and water and quiet. It opened in 1999, the same year the frame-making stopped, as if the two things had passed each other in the doorway. It is a genuinely fine place, and there is no bitterness owed to it. But it is impossible not to feel the whole shape of modern Britain in that one plot of ground. From a works that employed thousands to make things with their hands, to a campus of quiet, high-technology research and development. From making to knowing. There is even a building on the site, the Sir Colin Campbell building by the architect Ken Shuttleworth, that straddles Triumph Road, and a persistent local legend, which the architect firmly denies, that seen from the air it resembles two sprocket wheels joined by a chain. The works is gone, but the ground seems to remember what it was for. The people scattered as people do. The skilled brazers and filers and wheel builders carried their craft out into a country that had less and less use for it. That Sturmey Archer engineer behind the sandwich counter stands for all of them, for a whole kind of hard-won skill that the new economy had no column to record. What holds their memory now is not the works, which is rubble under a lawn, but the things gathered around it. Alan Sillitoe's fiction, still read, the oral histories of the Nottingham Black Archive, recovering the voices of Royden Allen and Howard Edwards and the Windrush workers who were Raleigh people too, the range of Raleigh bicycles and one Raleigh motorcycle kept at the Nottingham Industrial Museum out at Wallerton Park, the blue plaque the Nottingham Civic Society campaigned to raise in Sir Frank Bowden's name at the place where it all began. And the brand flew on, because that is exactly what the last Nottingham managers had fought to protect. Raleigh survived, as a mark, not a maker. After the buyout, it was Raleigh Cycle Limited. Then, on the 26th of April, 2012, it was bought by the Dutch Axel Group for something in the region of $80 million. Raleigh had sold around 850,000 bicycles worldwide the year before, still distributing into more than 140 countries. The bicycles are designed and specified in Britain and built in the Far East. In recent years, Axel itself was taken private by a consortium led by the American firm KKR and has cut UK jobs and moved out of that Eastwood base, describing it as outdated and inflexible. The heron still flies, but the nest that hatched it is long gone. From a 64-acre works, employing up to 8,800 people, making millions of bicycles a year, to a brand management operation importing boxed bicycles from the other side of the world. The bird on the badge is the same bird. Everything beneath it has changed. Chapter 11. What Remains. So this is where we end, standing on a university lawn, on a bright, ordinary morning, where the largest bicycle factory on earth once stood. Raleigh did not really die. That is almost the hardest part to sit with. It was hollowed out, absorbed by a conglomerate that never cared for bicycles, slowed by the very integration that had once made it invincible, sold offshore and pared down until its most famous name went for the price of a single gear, and its pensioners were left exposed, and finally reduced to what a brand can be reduced to, a label on a box shipped in from somewhere far away. What survives is precisely and only the thing those last managers refused to let die: the name. And yet, somewhere in Britain this morning, on a road perhaps not far from you, an old black roadster is being ridden to work. Its frame was drop-forged and dip-brazed in Nottingham, maybe 70 years ago, by people long gone, in a works long demolished, for a company that no longer makes anything at all. Its 3-speed hub still clicks cleanly between the gears that a Salford engineer named William Riley designed and never got the credit for. It was built, its makers always said, to survive a war. It has survived too, and the death of its own maker besides. That is the strange, quiet triumph left at the bottom of all this sorrow. A dying Victorian lawyer was handed a bicycle and told it might save his life. And it did. He gave the rest of that life to selling the same salvation to the world. Machines made so well, forged and brazed so completely, that they would outlive not only the men and women who rode them, but the great works that built them, and the very company whose name they carried on their frames. The bicycles that could survive a war outlived the company that made them. The heron flies on, the nest is empty, and the machines keep going, because that, in the end, was the whole point.